When Russia launched its full-scale war of aggression against the country at the start of 2022, many investors would have rushed for the exit. We did the opposite. We significantly increased our support for the country. And our shareholders, who include all the G7 and EU countries, are injecting more capital into the bank so that we can do even more in the future. Today, we provide strong support for what we call Ukraine's real economy, its energy sector, infrastructure in general, food security, and the private sector. By doing this, we hope to help Ukraine win the war, and even more importantly, to win the peace which follows. Our special guest lecturer can tell us how realistic a prospect that is. By welcoming you all to the EBRD this evening, we hope to help BEARR, and by encouraging clear thinking about the country's future, to help Ukraine as well. I will be here later if you have any questions about the EBRD and our relationship with Ukraine, but for now, I'll hand over to Nicola.
Thank you very much, Marcus. We're really grateful to the EBRD for hosting our annual lecture and reception. We have a long association with the EBRD. We really appreciate your generosity. It's also good to see so many supporters of the BEARR Trust here tonight. Many of you found us through our work in Ukraine, and I would like to thank you all for the impressive amounts of money you've given to our Ukraine emergency appeal. Since February 2022, we've passed more than £600,000 to local voluntary associations in Ukraine and also in Moldova. We pass on all donations we receive. We're volunteers, we don't take any overhead costs from the emergency appeal. And if you would like to see what our partners have been able to provide to people who've been displaced or affected by the war, you'll find copies of this, our annual review, in the hall, and a lot more information on our website. We're now coming up to the third winter since the full-scale invasion. Huge damage has been done to Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and attacks on civilians continue. And in the light of this, we are, of course, continuing our fundraising campaign. So please spread the word. We don't think of BEARR as an aid organisation, but we have demonstrated that sending small and regular amounts of cash to trusted local partners is, in fact, quite an effective aid mechanism. Also, we're in regular contact with many voluntary organisations throughout Ukraine. So we know firsthand how important these civil society organisations are in holding communities together and in building the resilience needed to face aggression and to build back afterwards. So we're already looking ahead to see what we can do to help them beyond the immediate physical needs. And I should probably say to help you, not you in the hall, but you, our Ukrainian partners, because I know that a lot of you are going to be watching the recording of this lecture later on. We're very honoured that Sir Lawrence Freedman is giving the lecture tonight, and that Sir Roderic Lyne will be moderating the questions afterwards. Between them, they have a very wide range of experience of international relations and a depth of expertise in the complexities of strategy and foreign policy that we look forward to tapping into this evening. Roderic is a former British ambassador in Moscow and also, I should say, a very supportive patron of the BEARR Trust. Lawrence is Emeritus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. He has researched, written about, and commented on the most important foreign policy issues of the last few decades. I know that there are in this room many keen followers of Lawrence's regular blog on Substack, Comment is Freed. It's the next best thing to hearing Lawrence live, which is, of course, what we now have the opportunity to do this evening. Lawrence, thank you very much and welcome.
Thanks, Nicola. It's a great honour to support this great charity, and I'm going to now try and answer the rather impossible question that I've given myself. It's maybe conversations in the relevant national capitals. The history of this conflict is already littered with discredited expectations, both optimistic and pessimistic. Most importantly, however, what happens next depends on decisions that have yet to be made or are being made by the relevant governments. They have choices. This question, however, of what comes next is hard to duck because it's asked so regularly and so urgently. There is currently quite a lot of doom around as people ask how long Ukraine can cope with the Russian onslaught and whether it's time for some compromised peace. This line of commentary assumes that there is a compromised peace that can be readily found if only Kyiv would abandon its dreams of total victory and appreciate the seriousness of its position. The compromised peace those urging this course usually have in mind, however, is not on offer. It bears very little relationship to the one that Putin proposes, which involves no compromise at all. It's just a demand for Ukraine's surrender. That doesn't mean that compromises might not yet be found in the future. In such a situation as this, with the fighting as ferocious as ever, neither side will wish it to be thought that they are desperate for a way out or wish to convey weakness in any way. In private, maybe they're thinking about how to bring the war to a conclusion. They may even have some future compromises in mind, but for now, they're trying to improve their positions. Neither wishes to show their hand. I'm not an impartial observer of the war. More than most conflicts I look at, this is one that can be approached, it seems to me, with complete moral clarity. It's not difficult to work out who is the aggressor and who is the aggrieved. Attempts to turn this round to show that somehow Russia had no choice but to invade in February 2022, or for that matter seize Crimea in March 2014, have either to play games with the historical record or to assume that whatever provocations they can discern in NATO policies or Ukraine's domestic politics, somehow these can be used to justify the occupation and subjugation of a neighbouring country. Vladimir Putin undoubtedly had his reasons for ordering the invasion, but we're not obliged to find them compelling. Yet while I'm partial, my task is to be dispassionate in analysis. Wars do not always end clearly or in a way that serves justice as well as peace. In wars, good does not always triumph over evil. So little can be taken for granted, and it's important to be clear-eyed about the situation and not to allow our hopes for Ukraine to guide our analysis to a suitably optimistic conclusion. Nonetheless, I think some of the gloom and doom is overdone. Not all of it can be discounted. But one of the reasons to be clear-eyed about it is to help identify the role that Western countries in particular can play in supporting Ukraine to achieve a better outcome that might otherwise be the case. If Russia was not a member of the Security Council, wielding a veto, then it might have been put under pressure to follow the UN Charter. If it was not a nuclear power, then NATO might have considered such blatant aggression in the heart of Europe to justify direct intervention to secure Ukraine's freedom. As it is, we confine ourselves to economic and military assistance. We are not at war, and our economies have no difficulty, whatever sometimes said, supporting the current levels of assistance to Ukraine. They should be able to do more. But at the moment, the most pressing question is whether election results in the US and financial pressures in Europe may lead us to do less. I'll return to this question at the end of the lecture, but I first want to consider the strategies being adopted by both Ukraine and Russia before looking at the military situation and then the possibilities for negotiation. President Zelensky's plan, as presented to the Rada in Kyiv on 16th of October, had 5 key elements. First, an immediate and unconditional invitation to join NATO. This is to set the process in motion rather than reach an early conclusion. And it's obviously also a direct challenge to one of Putin's key war aims, which is to keep Ukraine out of the alliance. Second, a permanent strengthening of Ukraine's security through guarantees from partners that their weapons can be used for strikes inside Russia and that Ukraine's neighbours will conduct joint air defence operations to protect Ukraine's skies. It would also allow for continued operations inside sovereign Russian territory to ensure buffer zones that protect Ukraine. Obviously, this is a reference to Kursk. Third, a non-nuclear deterrence plan. Before full membership of NATO, there needs to be security guarantees relating to how partners will come to Ukraine's aid if attacked again. Some of these security agreements are already in place, but Kyiv would want them to be firmed up. Fourth, guarantees to protect Ukraine's economic security and natural resources. These resources are important to Ukraine's partners, while if they can be denied to Russia, that will weaken Russian economy and, as Zelensky put it, its war machine. Fifth and lastly, an offer for the post-war period in which Ukraine forces would be able to replace some US military contingents stationed in Europe that have gained, because these Ukrainian units will have experienced real experience in modern warfare and in the use of Western weapons and in cooperation with NATO troops. This is to underline the fact that Ukraine is not just a supplicant, but could make its own significant contribution to the alliance. The obvious and acknowledged feature of this plan is that it is very much dependent on Ukraine's international partners to make it work, and in particular the United States. This means that there is little chance that the big issues of principle, NATO and long-range strike authorizations, being addressed until a new administration is in place. Although there are things that can and are being done before then. President Biden has just approved a new $425 million package of support and already indicated that he's prepared to set in motion a process for NATO accession. The interest from frozen Russian assets, although as yet not the assets, is going to be handed over more to Ukraine. Obviously, all forms of support will be jeopardized if Trump returns for a second term, although for reasons I shall come to, that may not be a given. For now, it needs to be a working assumption. Another feature of the plan that has gained less comment is that it does not presume a series of successful offensives to liberate territory. Remember that Russia still holds some 20% of Ukrainian territory, and it is Ukraine's stated war aim to get it all back. It therefore requires Russia to give it back, and this will require Russia to abandon its own war aims. The plan will succeed, according to Zelensky, by persuading Putin at some point during the coming year, that, quote, his geopolitical calculations are doomed. The emphasis, therefore, is on demonstrating to Putin that he cannot win, even if it is hard to show that he is bound to lose. In these situations, not losing can be as important an objective as winning, and one that is easier to attain. This is one reason why wars drag on. The more military aspects of Zelensky's plan are geared to ensuring that Ukraine does not lose. These include providing more protection to critical infrastructure and Ukrainian towns and cities, supporting Ukrainian forces trying to hold their positions with more ammunition and equipment, and facilitating the long-range strikes that can disrupt all Russian military preparations. Zelensky's plan was light on what extra steps Ukraine will need to follow. It's doing a lot with Western support to develop its own defence industry, but it is still struggling with mobilisation. As Jack Watling of RUSI has observed, quotes, the training pipeline has so far failed to provide enough personnel or give those soldiers sufficient training. There is more that Ukraine needs to do. As the weather deteriorates in Ukraine, the fighting may slow down somewhat, although it has not stopped during previous winters. The main concern about the coming months is the loss of so much energy generating capacity because of the deliberate Russian campaign to take it out. Peak electricity generation may only be about a third of what's required. Those of you who follow this issue know that one point of contention within Ukraine has been whether to stay with large power stations which are vulnerable to future Russian strikes or try to move towards a more decentralized system of small plants. But for now, the limits on supply mean that blackouts and shortages will have to be endured. Yet as we consider the ordeal to which Ukraine has been subjected, we can also note its remarkable resilience. I was struck by a recent tweet by Anton Garaschenko of the Ukrainian Institute for the Future. Long quote. Yes, things are consistently bad, but the key word here is not bad, but consistently. We have not been defeated. Our allies have not abandoned us. The front line has not been broken through. Our military industry continues to work and develop. The enemy has not captured a single regional centre. Logistics is functioning. Air defence defends cities. The military command maintains control. The parliament is working. Volunteers are working. Taxes are being paid. Russian oil and weapons depots are burning. Wheat is being harvested and bread is being baked daily. Trolley buses are running. And the third year of the Great War is underway. Let me now turn to Russia. The hope for a dawning sense of futility in the enemy capital is also a feature of Russian strategy. There is no peace offer on the table other than a reiteration of Moscow's most absolute objectives. Ukraine is required to accept the loss of 4 oblasts, Russia, Kherson and Zaporizhia, as well as Donetsk and Luhansk, and obviously also Crimea. A formal neutrality is also demanded. So no membership of NATO, plus other measures for the, quotes, demilitarization and denazification, which would limit Ukraine's ability to sustain serious armed forces and presumably require changes to the constitution to protect Russian language speakers. Putin has demanded that Kyiv agree to all of this before a ceasefire can be considered. So he's not offering a ceasefire to be followed by peace negotiations, which is the sequence that tends to be expected by the West. However, what was supposed to be a limited special military operation lasting no more than a few weeks has now been going on for almost 1,000 days. The costs to Russia have been immense in both human and material terms. It has made itself dependent on China, along with North Korea and Iran, while collapsing its political and economic relations with Europe. And after all this effort, it is no closer to victory. So long as it does not control the Ukrainian government, which was its objective on the 24th of February 2022, it has no way of forcing Ukraine to accept the loss. Because of Ukraine's dependence on external support, Russia can work on Ukraine's partners to get them to do less or even to abandon Kyiv altogether. This has always been a key element of its strategy. from the energy crunch with accompanying inflation that it caused in 2022 to the sabotage and misinformation campaigns that have been stepped up over the past year. The head of MI5 has spoken of how Russian agents have been on a mission to generate, quote, sustained mayhem on British and European streets. In doing this, Russia has relied upon a developing Ukraine fatigue, a term, it should be recalled, that was first heard over 2 years ago and has yet to manifest itself in terms of a significant loss of public support for Ukraine in its struggle. The evidence of fatigue is found largely in finance ministries and in those responsible for enforcing sanctions. If it comes in the United States, it will not be because of a general shift in opinion, but because of an election decided for other reasons that puts in place a president with a known antipathy to Ukraine and a proclaimed determination to arrange a peace in days. Putin has denied in the past that he's been waiting for it with any special eagerness for a Trump victory, but it would have been surprising if he had not calculated that this might provide him with a lifeline. Putin's other advantage over Ukraine is the size of the country. Its economy, the size of its country, the economy and its population. Extraordinary resources have been devoted to the war. Russia's planning to spend 13.2 trillion rubles, or approximately $95.4 billion for the year 2025. That is about $275 million a day. The working assumption in the West is that this can be sustained almost indefinitely. Perhaps that's safer than this alternative assumption, more regularly heard after a succession of sanctions packages were imposed on Russia, that the economy was rapidly approaching a cliff edge. Nonetheless, I think one should not underestimate the problems that those in charge of the Russian economy face, bearing in mind that the Russian economy managers have been somewhat more accomplished than the Russian generals. The more serious and obvious problem is that the economy is overheating. This is reflected in intense labour shortages, aggravated by the demands of the front line and to some extent hostility to immigrants, and by inflation, which at 7% is yet to be tamed by high interest rates, which are now up to 19%. Sanctions don't help either, even if ways around them can still be found, including with the help of China. The opportunity costs in terms of the civilian sector and infrastructure are considerable. Last winter there were problems with public utilities and breakdowns, maybe worse this time. There's also the question of the oil price. If the price of oil falls, then the Russian economy will be in more trouble. Against this backdrop, what's noticeable is that Russia has not been fighting this war as if it expects it to be long, but instead has been throwing resources and people into it at a frantic pace. Ever since the Ukrainian offensive petered out a year ago, Russian forces have been pushing hard on all fronts with their own offensives, despite incurring heavy losses in men and equipment. They have succeeded in keeping Ukrainian forces on the back foot. In recent months, they've had some breakthroughs in Donetsk, the result of exhaustion on the Ukrainian side, with units outgunned and outmanned, and with glide bombs making the life of those trying to hold these lines especially difficult. But in some other areas they failed. The Kharkiv offensive, which was launched last summer, didn't create the buffer zone Putin said it would. In addition, of course, Ukraine managed to have its own offensive into Russia's Kursk region a couple of months ago. And while this is yet to divert troops away from the main front in Ukraine, nor have the Ukrainians as yet been pushed out. While this is only a tiny fraction of Russian territory, it is embarrassing for Putin that it is still held by Ukraine. Zelensky has spoken of it as providing a Ukrainian buffer zone, and it could also potentially be traded in any peace deal. Lastly, while Ukraine cannot hurt Russia in the same way and to the same extent as Russia can hurt Ukraine, and it is frustrated by the lack of authorization to use Western systems against targets deep in Russia, it is developing long-range systems of its own, which it is producing in numbers. These can be used against any target it wishes. The most important targets are those storing weapon systems and ammunition, and a number have been attacked successfully. We've also seen some attacks on weapons factories. Earlier in the year, oil refineries presented soft targets which took out some Russian capacity. With so many potential targets to defend, these strikes pose a challenge for Russian air defences in setting priorities. Then the number of first-person view, FPV, drones on the battlefield has surged from just dozens to tens of thousands in under a year. These help to compensate for the shortfall in artillery shells. Ukraine has successfully developed and deployed its own long-range drones, as well as sea drones, which have allowed Ukraine to destroy a quarter of Russia's Black Sea fleet, denying Russia the ability to impose a successful blockade. According to American estimates, Russia's lost more than 600,000 personnel, dead and wounded, during the course of a war that was supposed to be concluded in weeks. Putin's trying to avoid further mobilization and is scrambling around to find more people to send to the front. Now, North Koreans are being deployed. We're not quite sure quite how many and where, but they're making a visit. Industry is working overtime to keep the front lines supplied. Now, the Russian generals have adapted in many ways to the demands of the war, and their tactics have been refined, but they still rely on the expendability of their soldiers. And without further mobilization, this may limit their ability to sustain the current level of activity into the new year. And while they have pushed Ukraine back, they have not achieved their objectives for this year and may be running out of time to do so. We've also had a recent assessment from Krylo Budanov, head of Ukraine's Directorate of Intelligence, dealing with Russia's ability to replace losses. Take tanks. Russia's relied on refurbishing its older Soviet-era tanks, but these are no longer in production, and they're being lost at a remarkable rate. New production of T-90 tanks at the planned rate of 150 a year just can't fill the gaps. One estimate is that by 4th of October this year, Russian forces had lost 539 tanks out of total losses of 1,830 vehicles, fighting in the Pokrovsk direction alone this year. Dara Masakot of the Carnegie Corporation reports that military equipment production, aside from drones, plateaued early this year, while the stockpile of multiple Soviet-era military equipment may be exhausted by 2026. Equally, new jet production is impressive. Budanov notes that Russia plans to produce only 14 Su-57 fighters in 2024. Now, North Korea and Iran have played an important part in keeping Russia going. And again, quoting Budanov, there's a very interesting description of the importance of North Korean artillery shells, noting that how much fighting intensifies within 8 to 9 days after the arrival of a new shipment, and that this effect lasts a couple of weeks. What is unclear is the extent of North Korea's stockpile and its readiness to run it down when it has its own needs. Where Russia has been able to ramp up production and cause Ukraine real difficulties has been with glide bombs, long-range drones, and Iskander missiles. It flies, according to Watling, between 1,000 and 1,300 long-range reconnaissance drones over Ukraine every day. And there's not a lot Kyiv at the moment can do about that. That's why its own electronic warfare and interceptor drone capabilities need to be scaled up. This capability has helped Russia at the front because it becomes difficult for Ukraine under that sort of surveillance to move its own artillery forward. And it's also why Ukrainian towns and cities, especially those close to the front line, have taken such a battering in recent months. It doesn't have sufficient air defences, including Patriot systems, to protect cities and the entire front line. It was once described to me as having a single duvet over a king-size bed. This is why Ukraine is so keen to find means to attack missile storage sites from a distance. In the end, the story of the past 2 years has been that fast-moving offensives are hard to achieve unless defences have already been thinned out. And if there's still no dramatic movements on the battlefield, and even the possibility that the intensity of the battles may slow down during the course of next year, what then are the possibilities of either a ceasefire or a full negotiated settlement? Ukraine, I believe, feels that it has little choice but to continue with the war. It notes Putin's regular dismissal of Ukrainian sovereignty, let alone the legitimacy of its government. Russia's cruel behaviour in areas that it has occupied, the disregard of past promises to respect Ukrainian security, including the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, don't give encouragements. So for all these reasons, it's unsurprisingly reluctant to do a deal with Russia, certainly not one without guarantees from NATO states. Does that mean it would reject all compromise deals? Looking at Ukrainian polling, one can imagine some territorial concessions, for example, over Donetsk and Luhansk, although that's up to Ukraine to decide on. But I don't think the Ukraine accept any deal at all that didn't make it feel that it had security for the future. What about Russia? In discussions of possible outcomes over the past couple of years, a hierarchy of Russian territorial claims has been identified. First Crimea, then Donetsk and Luhansk, then Kherson and Zaporizhia. This reflects the order in which Putin appears to have thought about annexing them. The last two are already problematic because, as with quite a bit of the Donbass as well, they're not yet fully under Russian control. For now, they would require Ukraine agreeing to withdraw troops from its own territory. But it's important to keep in mind that they have been formally annexed, and as far as Moscow is concerned, if nobody else, they're now part of the Russian Federation. Moreover, even recognizing Crimea as the most important acquisition than other territories, the others are also important to provide a land bridge and to ensure that it can be kept supplied and safe. So at most, one can imagine a negotiation around Kherson and Zaporizhia, leading to some Russian troop withdrawals. And there's been a little bit of kite flying on that recently. The obvious problem, however, with all the territories held, other than Crimea, is that they have been ruined by the war. Towns and villages have been obliterated, cities subjected to regular bombardment, and infrastructure and industries wrecked. They're full of unexploded ordnance, and the environment generally has been degraded. They've been depopulated, and much of the population remaining is hostile to a Russian occupation and will need policing. To reconstruct and revive these territories will be extraordinarily expensive and require continuing subsidies to keep them afloat. From Moscow's perspective, if Ukraine is not kept demilitarized and out of NATO, then there will be a long new border to be defended, and this will require a major commitment of Russian forces for the indefinite future, with the possibility of sabotage and subversion to the rear. This is why Putin wanted a puppet government in Kyiv in the first place. Without one, for Russia, the situation is unstable. Now, with control over the media, Putin can spin any deal as representing a great victory. And from what we can tell, again, from polling, and there are some in Russia, this would be welcomed by the Russian people who do want negotiations, even though they accept the official rationale for the war and remain proud of their armed forces. But a situation in which the rump Ukraine was independent and able to reconstitute its army and forge new security relationships with NATO countries would not be seen as a great victory. The acquisition of ruined territories would be a mixed blessing, remaining desolate for some time as a testament to a foolish war. This takes us again to the importance of not losing even when there can be no decisive victory. While the war continues, Putin can avoid an awkward reckoning. For this gain, was the sacrifice really worth it? But it also means that when the eventual reckoning does come, it will be more severe. Zelensky's route to winding down the war envisages building on agreements on specific things, for example, prisoner exchanges. He's spoken of the possibility of an agreement not to target critical infrastructure, though of course that would require Russia to abandon one of its most effective forms of pressure on Ukraine. So it's hard to see Moscow agreeing to that, at least not until Ukraine has shown it can cope with another winter. Putin's preferred route has been through Washington. This is in line with his dismissal of the Ukrainian government as neo-Nazis, his belief that it is at any rate a puppet of Western governments, so that the war is really won with NATO and can only be resolved at that level. That's why he would welcome direct communication with the American president, and he could look forward to it should Trump return to power. Trump believes that he can do a deal on almost anything. The one that Vice Presidential candidate J.D. Vance has spoken about in an interview was actually not far from that proposed by Putin. And we could assume that Trump could use the threat of an immediate withdrawal of all support to get Zelensky to agree at least to be part of the negotiations, although Putin will have little interest in talking to him. How quickly this could happen is unclear. Key positions in government would have to be approved, and the ease with which that could be done would depend on what happens in the congressional elections as well as the presidential. If Ukraine insists, as I believe it would, continuing with the fight, still helped by European partners, I'm not sure that Trump would consider it a good look to be abandoning a country in a fight against Russia so decisively. All one can say that if Trump wins, how he engages with Putin and the possible outcomes of any negotiations will dominate all considerations of the issue. If Trump loses, we will have President Harris. I believe this would be an opportunity to revitalize the West Ukraine policy, recommit to its support, and look for ways to add to the pressure on Russia. With the uncertainty of the election out of the way, Putin will have to accept that Ukraine will not be abandoned, and that if he is going to cut his losses, he might as well do so quickly. There is, of course, another possibility that Russia might just decide to reduce the tempo of its operations, concentrate, as it did in late 2022, on defensive preparations, keeping up the attacks on Ukraine's civil society, denying its economy the chance to recover, and waiting for something else to turn up. It seems to me the stakes are extraordinarily high for Europe. While I would not argue that Russia's next step after defeating Ukraine would be to move immediately against the Baltic states, this would usher in a period of intense instability in Europe and recriminations amongst allies. Given the combined strength of European countries, leaving aside the US, it would represent a failure of political will and judgment. If support for Ukraine can be stepped up and sustained, it's hard to know how long Russia will stay in the fight. Autocracies are different from democracies. They can be very brittle, even while before they turn out to be brittle, it seems like they can go on forever. So to return to the question posed in the title, I don't know what comes next. There are big decisions to be made in Kyiv and Moscow, but there are also decisions to be made in Western capitals. and how those decisions are made over the coming months will determine Europe's stability and security for the rest of this decade and beyond. This is really a critical moment in the history of our continent, and events over the coming weeks and months will really determine where we're going for some time to come. Thank you very much.
Lawrence, thank you very much. That was absolutely masterly, as we would expect, and it's no surprise at all that your lecture has attracted a record audience to this annual event. It's a great tribute to the BEARR Trust that they've managed to grab hold of you, because for the past 3 years, with the possible exception of Taylor Swift, nobody has been in more demand in this town. We now have a period for questions, and I was just seeking instructions from Nicola on how long. I think we've probably got 20 or 25 minutes. We all have to leave the building by 8 o'clock, I think. And as Marcus has kindly said, there are going to be drinks available after this. Laurie, I'd like to abuse the privilege of the chair to ask the first question, if I may. There are two irreducible conditions, it seems to me, for an eventual settlement. One is that the Russians should irrevocably and formally recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine. And the other, which you spoke about, is that Ukraine should have absolute guarantees of its security. And President Zelensky's third point really pointed at that. But can I push you a little bit further on security guarantees? Clearly, this has to be more than a bit of paper. It is unlikely, in the first instance, whatever one might think of the idea, that it will involve Ukrainian immediate membership of NATO. That isn't going to get past Turkey. It's probably not going to get past the US Senate. We can perhaps leave Hungary and Slovakia on one side in this debate. And I'm not sure, really, whether it would get past Germany. So it's probably not realistic to think that the security guarantees would be Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. But it will have to be something tangible, presumably, therefore, bilateral guarantees from some serious, credible Western military powers. Would that involve the stationing of foreign troops on Ukrainian soil? How likely is it that they would be American? How likely is it indeed that we in this country would need to look at sending serious armed force detachments, air force, ground troops, and equipment into Ukraine as part of a deal some way down the road?
I agree with all of that.
It was a question, not an answer.
Well, you were pointing to the answer. I think it's important that the door is opened to NATO because Putin wants it closed and wants it definitively closed. But in practice, I think you're right that it's going to be very hard for this accession to happen quickly. I don't think it's impossible, but it won't happen quickly. And again, it depends on the different dynamics of a new American administration. If Harris wins, I think if Trump wins, that's even less likely. Bilateral security deals don't depend on the United States. And a lot of discussion has been going on this year, led initially by France, about the possibility of basing some forces, largely for training purposes, in Western Ukraine. That's possible. Looking back, one describe what happened with the full-scale invasion as a failure of deterrence. I don't think we tried very hard to deter. But looking back, what might have deterred would have been basing forces in Ukraine. It's a sovereign country. There was no reason, in principle, why this couldn't happen. but we never sort of took it seriously as an idea. But I think it would have to be taken seriously. Who? I think it'd probably start with Poland, and then there are other countries, maybe including ours, that would join in, possibly only with small detachments. Who knows? But I think that would be one of the things you can do. And it's worth keeping in mind that even Article 5 is not cast iron, as many people occasionally point out. It assumes a possibility, but it doesn't make it certain. So I think you will see more. I think also a lot of what can be done to keep the deterrent going is to keep on building up Ukrainian capabilities and forces. Ukraine used to be a major defense manufacturer in Soviet times. And that it's now becoming a major defense manufacturer. So I think you're going to start seeing a variety of ties developing between Ukraine and Western countries and European countries once the fighting is over, on the assumption it doesn't end with any subjugation of Ukraine, which I don't think it will. I mean, my view, it's much more likely to carry on in some ways, maybe at a lower level, than end in that way. But I think that's... so I think we're going to see lots of different ways at different levels that may not quite be the same as an Article 5, but together adds up to something that can't be discounted in Moscow.
Thank you. Can I now invite questions from the floor? I see one right there. If you could stand up and perhaps give your name and wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Sure. Jonathan, I'm a podcast host focusing on Ukraine. So the appearance of North Korean troops, is this a red herring? Is it a provocation? Or could it take on the character of something more strategic? And if it's the latter, what do North Korea and China potentially stand to gain from it?
I'm not sure China's got a lot to gain from it. I mean, China doesn't want Russia to lose, but it has kept its distance in some ways. A lot of its support has been economic. There are questions about the extent to which it's provided full weapons as opposed to components of weapons. So China is in there with Putin, but not to the extent that Kim has been, and he certainly hasn't, and Xi hasn't endorsed Russian war aims in the way that Kim has done. I mean, so North Korea is now belligerent. I mean, there's no other way of putting it, and that has consequences. So it's strategic. I mean, somebody else has entered the war, and I think it's an issue that, when we get a better measure of how serious this is, we'll have to come to terms with. One immediate consequence is South Korea, which, again, you may recall at the start of the war, was not that bothered about helping Ukraine, but gradually became quite an important help in terms of ammunition. Has already indicated it's now going to feel under some obligation to help more, which will be a help. And then we just don't know what's going to happen. Are they going to backfill and let Russian troops go to the front? There's been reports that they're appearing, they may be deployed to Kursk because Russia hasn't got quite enough at the moment to push the Ukrainians out. What happens if some start to defect? I can't imagine, it doesn't seem as a bit of an opportunity to a few of them. What happens when a number start to get killed? What will be the command arrangements? Looking at the way Russian commanders have used their own people, including convicts or people from ethnic minorities and so on, you might expect quite a few of them to see North Korean troops very much in that category of expendable troops. That may not go down that well in Pyongyang. Maybe Kim doesn't care. So there's a lot of questions that are being raised by this. I don't think it's enough to be decisive on the battlefield. It's an important statement by North Korea. And it's one that we have to watch. I mean, we spend a lot of time worrying about what can happen in the world. But the peninsula is one of the things to worry about, because Kim generally has been taking a more belligerent tone recently, including with South Korea. So I don't think it's a good sign of anything, even though I suspect it's one with which Ukraine can cope. I don't think it indicates things going on in the world that are making life more difficult and disturbing in this so-called axis, which overstated term of Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, more of a thing.
John Lloyd.
Thanks. Sir Lawrence, it's about the wider effect of the war, or one of the wider effects of the war. Is it the case, does it seem to be the case, that this has already dug a much deeper trench between what you might call the autocratic world and the democratic world? And the more so since after the last few days in Kazan with the conference of the BRICS, it seemed to be the case that a number of countries which had been in between the West and the East, as it were, have now chosen to join the autocratic world, at least in this context, in the context of Ukraine, and have made it clear that they're not going to assist Ukraine and may even cheer on Russia. Do you think that's what's happened? And if it has happened, is it going to get more the case?
It's a good question, Joe, but I think it's slightly more complex than that. Take India as a good example. Modi had a summit a while ago with Putin on a day a hospital was bombed in Ukraine. And this was not found to be a good look back in India. It was commented on. Next, he turns up in Kyiv and gives Zelensky the same hug he'd given to Putin. And I think and India is still a democracy. So I think you need to distinguish between not being wished to be seen to be follow the West wherever the West wishes to go, wishing to keep independence from the West, which I think is important to these countries, between giving support to Russia. And most of them are quite careful on that. India has sent some ammunition to Ukraine, or I believe some ammunition has gone from Ukraine to India. So I wouldn't assume there's a big coalition forming up based on the BRICS. Even China, its formal position, and China's got diplomatic relations with Ukraine, before the war, before the full-scale invasion, was a major importer of Ukrainian grain and so on. So, and Zelensky has spoken to Xi. Turkey has played, again, it sees itself as being potential mediator and so on. So I think it's a more complex role. One of the things Biden did early on after the full-scale invasion is to talk about this in terms of democracy versus autocracy, which I think for us, from our point of view in Europe, is fair enough. But actually, we want quite a lot of autocracies to support Ukraine. In practice, that's the realpolitik of it all. So I think what you have is just you need to recognize that this is a much more multipolar, complex world than it used to be. And countries that would once have fallen in behind the West are no longer ready to do so. They think we're hypocritical. They don't, why aren't we paying more attention to Sudan? So there's all sorts of views like that. So I think Putin's happy to be in a place where he's able to talk with other world leaders in a way he can't do elsewhere. But I think there are limits on how far it takes it.
I was looking to see this. Yes. Sorry, it's quite difficult to see against the light. Is that Harold Libman? Yes.
Harold Lipman. I believe, and you may feel that this is controversial, that the war could have been prevented both in 2014, prior to the annexation of the Crimea, firstly, and secondly, in 2022, prior to the Russian invasion of the Donbass. And at that time, and just briefly I'll tell you this, at that time I proposed to the UN, the USA, the EU, Russia, and the Ukraine, that they should consider Findalization of the Ukraine, by which I mean that in 1939, as you may recollect, there was a short but savage war between the Soviet Union and Finland, and a peace was brokered, and the result was that 10% of Ukrainian territory in Karelia was lost, but for 80 years they had security and peace because they remained neutral. They had relations both with the Soviet Union and the West. Now, a similar situation could possibly have been brokered either, as I say, in 2014 or in 2022. And to try in 2022 to promote this, I was in communication with President Zelensky and President Putin. Now, I would like to... I'm sorry. Yes, my question is, do you think that this might possibly have been a possible prevention of the war could have occurred?
No. And let me give you two reasons. First, whereas I think it's important to Putin to keep Ukraine out of NATO and have neutrality, the Ukraine was not about to enter NATO in 2014, nor in 2022. It wasn't on the cards. And even now, when the case is much stronger, for the reasons Rod just gave, there are a lot of reasons why it still might not happen. Secondly, I don't think that was the problem for Putin. The problem was internal developments within Ukraine, and this, I think, goes back to the Orange Revolution in 2004-05, when he saw Ukraine, which he found very difficult to imagine as not part of Russia, when he saw it becoming a place in which democracy, liberal democracy, not his sort of democracy, would take hold. And if you look at the famous long essay he wrote in July 21, published in July 21, which may have been one of the worst results of COVID that he had time to write it, was that it's about the very legitimacy of a Ukrainian state, a historical record that ties it to Russia, certainly Novorossiya, and a denial of the legitimacy of the government. And that has been a theme since Euromaidan, in the Revolution of Dignity, as the Ukrainians call it. So I don't think that was the problem. Could it have been avoided? A.J.P. Taylor once said all wars can be avoided. And looking back, you can think of things that could have been done. But personally, I think the things that would have avoided it would have been more on the strengthening ties with the West side rather than on neutralizing Ukraine. The problem is that this, and there's a strong view in the West still that Ukraine is a buffer state. But the big problem with being a buffer state is you get buffeted. and that was Ukraine's problem. And it's that uncertainty about its future which has harmed Ukraine and led to not a great political history since 1991, and created this continuing uncertainty about its security. I think that needs to be resolved for there to be peace.
I might take this opportunity to point out that Harold Lippman has just published his second book of Memories of Moscow and is very kindly, I believe, Harold, donating half of the proceeds to the BEARR Trust, for which many thanks. We have time, I think, for 2 short questions. There will, of course, be plenty of opportunity to grill Laurie over a drink after we wind up this formal session. There was one, yes, lady here.
Rosemary Thomas, and just circling back, if I may, to the question of security guarantees, because until Ukraine is in either NATO or the EU, or ideally both, it's always going to be vulnerable to Russia because we can't trust Russia's word. So it's time for some really creative thinking. And does the Joint Expeditionary Force have any value whatsoever in those calculations?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we move to the sort of situation in which, in response to Rod's question, we were talking, then yeah, I mean, the Joint Expeditionary Force is something that is can be outside of the formal NATO structure. I mean, there is actually, I think I'm correct in saying, from before the full-scale invasion, a joint Polish-UK-Ukrainian security agreement. These are things you can do. It's worth noting that if NATO's difficult, the Russians now and again say they're less bothered about Ukraine joining the EU. So I think that would, but it's a much longer process. It's a more difficult process. And of course, this whole wretched business began in 2013 with Zelensky, with Yanukovych about to sign an association agreement with the EU, which if Putin had just left well alone, I mean, it's just worth remembering, going back to Harold's question, this whole business started by Putin undermining the most pro-Russian president of Ukraine he was likely to get, Yanukovych, because Yanukovych was going to sign an agreement which would have led to very little.
Final question, gentleman up there.
Thank you for a fascinating lecture, Sir Lawrence. My name is Michael Holman. You mentioned a number of times the danger of fatigue among European nations and nations elsewhere in support for Ukraine. Do you detect any loss of support for Zelensky within Ukraine, because Ukraine has suffered a huge amount? And do you detect within Russia any dissatisfaction with the way in which the war has affected the economy and various other elements of Russian society?
Oh, it's another lecture. Yeah, I think on the first question, I mean, the polling's there. Zelensky is less popular than he was. But it's not fatigue with the war. I mean, it's difficult decisions are made. Anybody who talks with the Ukrainians know there are big issues about martial law, about, I don't think people expect there to be elections while a chunk of the country is still under occupation. But there are issues about the way that political life in Ukraine is being conducted, about whether Zelensky always makes the right strategic choices. Was Kursk a good idea? Could the offensive have been managed differently in 2023? I mean, it's not surprising. It happened to Churchill during the Second World War. This is a very difficult situation, but by and large, Zelensky still has support, and the war aims have support. Russia's a much more difficult question, and Rod's a better place than I to answer it. What you can tell from polling is that people would like the war to be over. I don't think there's much doubt of that. But they're not particularly keen on Russia being seen to be defeated because they're patriotic, because of what they know and don't know, and so on. I thought it was instructive in the only sort of big rift we've had, which is the Prigozhin mutiny of summer last year, that what people weren't doing was rushing out into the streets, or if they did, it's indicated as Prigozhin, as the Wagner group passed through, not a lack of enthusiasm for what he was doing. But as he moved towards Moscow, you saw a little bit of anxiety amongst the elite. But what you didn't have, look back at the attempted coup at the end against Gorbachev, or the battle of the White House under Yeltsin. Well, these sort of great popular enthusiasm to sustain the government. I think in a country in which people daren't say very much, there's a lot of passivity. I suspect if the war, when Putin goes, and we're all mortal, there'll be eventually some revisionism about, but at the moment he's there, and this is a man who's had over 20 years building up his security apparatus and has used the war to squeeze out all dissent and all dissenters.
And there we must wind up. Lawrence is a sort of perpetual motion machine. He's a man of the most extraordinary energy who can work on 6 different subjects at once. And I discovered that when we were sitting together on the Iraq inquiry, which consumed all of my attention for 7 years. While we were doing that, he just published the official 2-volume history of the Falkland Islands. He just published a magisterial book on American involvement in the Middle East. He was simultaneously a vice principal of King's College London. And then as we were writing up our report, he pops up with an 800-page book on the history of strategy. Well, this is not the only thing he's doing now. If any of you read his Substack today, it was on a completely different subject. But we are immensely grateful. We've managed to capture you for this period, Lawrence, and we're going to keep you captive at least for about another 3/4 of an hour over a drink. So thank you very much indeed. A big round of applause.